A millionaire accustomed to cold decisions receives a simple security report about an employee at his hotel. The document reveals she was stealing towels and antiseptics, and termination seemed inevitable. But after secretly following her to her home, he discovers a reality that shatters everything he thought he knew about justice. What he finds in that small alleyway forever changes his life, his family, and his empire. Nathan Montgomery had learned from an early age that the world was divided into two types of people: those who made decisions and those who lived with the consequences of them. At 32, he was, without a shadow of a doubt, in the first group. Owner of a chain of 7 luxury hotels spread across New York City, the Hamptons, and the Jersey Shore, Nathan had the kind of routine that would make any middle-aged executive envious. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning, swam 40 laps in the pool of his Upper East Side penthouse, drank a simple black coffee while reading 3 newspapers simultaneously, and arrived at the central office before any of his 230 direct employees. It wasn't the money that drove him. Money had come too early for him to still admire it. It was control. The sensation of having every gear in the right place, every figure balanced, every person fulfilling exactly the role they were hired for. Those who didn't perform were out. It was that simple, and Nathan didn't waste time with guilt. The Montgomery Grand Hotel on 5th Avenue was the crown jewel of his empire. 23 floors of white marble and smoked glass, 2 restaurants with Michelin stars, a full spa on the 18th floor, and an occupancy rate that rarely fell below 82%. That was where he spent most of his weekdays, in a glass-walled office on the 22nd floor with a view of the city he had learned to dominate before even turning 30. That Tuesday, the day had unfolded like any other. A meeting with managers at 8, contract reviews with the legal department at 10, a business lunch with an investment fund at 12:30, and an entire afternoon of reports piled on the solid oak desk his father had given him when he opened the first hotel years ago. Nathan had a complicated relationship with that desk, complicated in the same way he had with everything that came from Edward Montgomery, his father. It was 5:40 in the afternoon when Sarah, his assistant, walked in with a beige envelope and placed it on top of the other papers with an expression Nathan had learned to recognize. It was the expression of someone delivering something expecting a reaction, yet trained not to show anticipation. It was the security department report. Nathan opened it without haste. He read the first page with the same coldness he read any other document. The facts were laid out in chronological order, with dates, times, and camera screenshots printed on grainy A4 paper. A housekeeping employee had been filmed on 8 different occasions over 2 months, taking items from the establishment inside her own work bag. The report from the supervisor, Mrs. Martha Higgins, a 12-year veteran, was objective. Hand towels, bottles of hospital-grade antiseptic, sterile gauze and medical tape. 8 occurrences, 2 months. The employee's name was Clara Sanders, 38 years old, hired just over a year ago for the afternoon shift in the room sanitation department. At the end of the report, the supervisor had written a 3-line recommendation: immediate termination for cause without severance, with a notification to HR and the opening of a standard administrative file. Nathan had done the same with other employees before. Signing it took less than 10 seconds. He picked up his pen. The tip of the pen rested on the dotted line at the bottom of the page, and then, for some reason Nathan couldn't name at that moment, it stopped. It stayed there, suspended in the air a millimeter from the paper, while he stared at the name printed on the sheet. Clara Sanders, 38 years old, 1 year with the company, towels, antiseptic, gauze, and tape. Something didn't add up, and Nathan Montgomery, a man who had built a hotel chain based on his ability to identify what was out of place, couldn't ignore that feeling. It wasn't sympathy. Nathan wasn't prone to sympathy. It was something closer to a logic that was incomplete. People who steal from hotels steal valuables. Towels were washable, cheap to replace, and had no resale market. Hospital antiseptic and gauze had no appeal on the black market. No one risked losing their job over 8 bottles of cleaning supplies, unless they needed them more than the job. Nathan put the pen down. He stood up from his chair, walked to the window, and watched Fifth Avenue below with its gridlocked cars and hurried pedestrians and their stories he would never stop to hear under normal conditions. He thought about calling Martha and telling her he had signed it. He thought about simply leaving the report for the next day. He thought about several things a man like him did when he wanted to avoid something he didn't quite understand yet. He stood there for 4 minutes, an eternity for a man who made decisions in seconds. When he returned to the desk, he didn't sign the paper. Instead, he opened the side drawer, took out a notepad, and wrote 3 lines in his characteristic, fast, slanted handwriting. Then he folded the paper, tucked it into the inner pocket of his blazer, and called Sarah on the intercom. When she entered, Nathan was already standing with his blazer over his arm. "Sarah, I need the exact clock-out time for Clara Sanders today. No contact with her, no notice to the supervisor, no record of this inquiry. Just the time." Sarah blinked twice, which was the maximum surprise she allowed herself to show after 5 years of working with him. "I can check the electronic time clock system now." "Do it." She returned 2 minutes later with the information. Clara Sanders clocked out at 6:30 p.m. every weekday through the service entrance that led to the side street of the hotel. Nathan looked at his watch. It was 6:02 p.m. He grabbed his car keys. The hotel parking garage was 2 levels below the lobby. Nathan took the elevator down, passed the valet with a quick nod, and got into his black SUV. He drove slowly up the side ramp, parked at the corner of the street where the service exit was located, and turned off the headlights. It was 6:26 p.m. Sitting in the dark of the car, Nathan Montgomery, owner of 7 luxury hotels, a man who had built an empire through cold decisions and precise judgments, realized for the first time in a long time that he didn't know exactly what he was doing there, nor exactly what he expected to find. And this uncertainty, strange and uncomfortable like a stone in his shoe, was the most human thing he had felt in years. The service door opened at 6:33 p.m. Clara Sanders walked out, carrying a large fabric bag on her shoulder, and walked quickly toward the avenue. She wore a faded navy blue blouse, white sneakers that had already turned yellow, and had her hair pulled back in a low bun that had lost its shape during the shift. She walked with the firm step of someone who is already late before even leaving work, eyes on the ground, without looking sideways. Nathan started the car and began to follow at a distance. There was no plan. There was only that persistent feeling that something was wrong with what the report described, and that he needed to understand what it was before signing any papers. That was all he had. And for a man accustomed to operating with certainties, it was a disconcerting amount of nothing. But he kept driving, keeping 2 cars of distance, with his low beams on and an unanswered question pulsing in the back of his chest. Where was Clara Sanders going with that bag? Every afternoon, Monday through Friday, when no one was watching. Clara Sanders didn't take a taxi, didn't call an Uber, didn't get into any car. She walked to the bus stop on the corner of the avenue and stood in line with her bag hugged to her chest, eyes on her phone clock, the screen already cracked in one corner. Nathan parked the SUV in a loading zone half a block away and watched through the rearview mirror. There was something almost surreal about being there. Him and his car, which cost more than many people earned in a decade, spying on a woman in a crowded bus line on a Tuesday afternoon in Manhattan, but he didn't leave. He stayed. The bus arrived with that characteristic screech of something that endures more than it should. Clara boarded without haste, found a spot by the middle window, and disappeared into the mass of passengers. Nathan waited for the bus to close its doors and then began to follow it through traffic, maintaining enough distance not to draw attention. It was a strange maneuver in a car of that caliber, and he was aware of it, but awareness wasn't enough to make him stop. The bus went down the avenue, crossed into the Lower East Side, and eventually headed toward the outer boroughs. It crossed a bridge into an area of Brooklyn that Nathan knew only by the names on his GPS maps and had never had a reason to visit personally. The landscape changed gradually and almost imperceptibly, as happens with the great transitions in life, so slowly that you only notice the transformation when you are already on the other side. The buildings became smaller and darker. Designer boutiques gave way to thrift stores, discount pharmacies, and butcher shops with prices handwritten on pieces of cardboard taped to the glass. The bright cafes were replaced by corner bodegas with open doors and televisions blaring in the corner. The sidewalks lost their granite and gained irregular cement, with half-filled potholes and trees whose roots had buckled the ground into pieces. Nathan watched everything through the windshield with an attention that was not at all touristy. It was the attention of someone seeing something that had always existed, but was only now willing to look. The bus stopped at several points. Clara didn't get off. Nathan always waited in the line behind, slow enough not to lose sight of the bus, fast enough not to provoke honking. Some drivers looked at him sideways, intrigued by that expensive car moving with such calculated caution. He ignored them. At the second stop, after a bridge covered in graffiti, Clara got off. Nathan drove past the stop and parked 50 yards ahead on an irregular shoulder where other older cars were already parked. He got out carefully, locked the car, and began to walk on foot, keeping his distance. Clara had crossed the avenue at the light and was now on a narrower sidewalk, walking with the rhythm of someone who knows every stone of the path. She didn't look back once. She had no reason to imagine someone was following her. She entered a street with no visible name, at least none that Nathan could identify on any sign. The houses here were small and crammed together, with rusted iron gates and clotheslines crossing small yards. The smell was of food, charcoal smoke, and something damp coming from the walls. Children played in the street with a worn rubber ball, and a dog slept in the middle of the path without anyone around showing any concern. A radio played loud music from a house on the left. From another window came the smell of rice and beans that Nathan had last eaten, perhaps in childhood, when Mrs. Gable used to make it on Saturday afternoons in the kitchen of his father's house in Westchester. The name emerged from the depths of his memory so quickly and involuntarily that he didn't even realize it at first. Just the smell, just that specific smell of rice, beans, garlic, and bay leaf that still lived somewhere inside him, in a compartment that had been closed long ago and whose walls he had built with great care. Clara turned another corner. Nathan quickened his pace to keep her in sight. The street was now unpaved in sections, with puddles of stagnant water from the previous week's rains forming small dark lagoons in the potholes. There were no working streetlights. Only an occasional wire stretched between windows, with hanging bulbs that flickered with the instability of the precarious power grid. The neighborhood breathed at a frequency Nathan didn't know, a frequency of daily effort, of survival negotiated day by day, of dignity maintained with whatever is left after the month eats everything. She stopped in front of an alleyway that opened between two houses. The entrance was narrow, poorly lit, with irregular loose stone ground and weeds growing in the cracks. Clara entered without hesitation. Nathan stood at the entrance for a few seconds, looking into that narrow corridor and calculating, in the automatic way he calculated everything, what was on the other side. Then he went in. The alley was about 40 feet long. At the end, there was a small dirt yard where an old tree stretched its branches over a low tin roof. It was a small construction, wood and masonry mixed in an improvised way, with walls stained by dampness and a window covered by a faded floral curtain. Through a gap in the curtain came a weak yellowish light, the kind that comes from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Clara stopped at the door, took a key from the bottom of her bag, and entered quietly, as if she were careful not to startle whoever was inside. Nathan moved a few steps closer until he was near a dead lamppost by the wall. He leaned there and looked through the half-open window. What his eyes found on the other side of that torn curtain was something for which no business meeting, no security report, and no experience accumulated in years of cold decisions had prepared him. Clara had placed her bag on the floor and knelt beside a bed pushed against the wall. On the bed, an older woman lay with her eyes closed, breathing with visible effort, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm Nathan immediately recognized as that of someone struggling to do something that for the rest of the world is automatic. Covered by a thin sheet, the elderly woman had her legs exposed from mid-calf down, and even at a distance, even with the dim light and the curtain as a filter, Nathan could see there were old bandages on those legs. Bandages that needed to be changed. Clara opened the fabric bag with those hands he had seen only in the security camera screenshots and took out of it exactly what the report described: the towels, The bottles of antiseptic, the folded gauze, the medical tape. Nathan stood frozen. There was no greed in those movements, there was urgency. There was the kind of care that isn't learned, that is born from a love that asks no permission and expects no condition. Clara began to undo the old bandages with a delicacy that contradicted the visible fatigue in every muscle of her face, and Nathan saw the elderly woman's legs for the first time without the covering of the old dressings. He looked away for a second, not out of weakness, but because he felt he was seeing something that belonged only to that room and those two women, and that his presence there, hidden and voyeuristic, was an invasion that shamed him in a way he couldn't explain with the words he knew. But he didn't leave. He stood there in the dark, with his $3,000 blazer covered by the night mist that was beginning to fall, and he gradually understood, with the painful slowness of someone who had always fled from certain truths, what was on the other side of that security report that had reached his hands that afternoon. What Supervisor Martha Higgins had called theft in those 3 objective lines written with the confidence of someone who already knows the outcome was the only resource a daughter had found to keep her mother alive. And Nathan Montgomery, a man who made cold decisions with the naturalness of someone signing $1,000,000 checks before breakfast, stood in the dark of that dirt yard and was unable to make any decision at all for a time he couldn't measure. The mist slowly dampened the fabric of his blazer, but Nathan didn't move. There was something in that scene that held him there with a force that had no name within the vocabulary he had built for himself over 32 years. It wasn't pity. He knew pity, and pity took the form of a distant, manageable feeling, the kind resolved with a year-end donation to an NGO recommended by his PR team. This was something else. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected an angle you always knew existed, but never had the courage to face directly. Clara worked in silence. Her hands moved with an economy of gestures that only comes from habit, from the daily repetition of a procedure she had learned not in any nursing course, but in the hardest school there is: necessity. She cleaned her mother's wounds with a care that was almost sacred, wrapping the gauze with precision, fixing the tape with her fingertips, then adjusting the sheet with the kind of touch that needs no words to say what it means. The elderly woman opened her eyes during the procedure. Nathan couldn't hear what they were saying behind the curtain and the half-open window, but he saw the movement of the mother's lips, and he saw Clara lean closer, her face inches from the woman's, responding in a low voice with a smile that cost her dearly, but that she gave anyway. That was when Nathan saw the boy for the first time. There was a corner to the right of the entrance that was out of the window's angle, which was why he hadn't noticed him before. The teenager was about 16, maybe a little younger, thin with that lankiness of someone growing too fast for their body to keep up. He was standing in front of an improvised sink, washing dishes in a basin with water that Nathan, given the night temperature and the absence of any visible heater in that room, concluded was cold. The boy's hands were cracked at the knuckles, with that characteristic redness of skin that faces cold and excessive soap too often. But what caught Nathan's attention weren't the hands, it was the face. The teenager looked at his mother and grandmother with an expression that was not at all childish. It was an expression of tenderness mixed with a maturity that shouldn't fit a face of that age. Every so often he would stop washing, dry his hands on his pants and stare at the bed with slightly narrowed eyes, as if he were mentally measuring something that didn't yet have words, but that weighed heavily. Very heavily. Nathan took a step back in the dark. He leaned his back against the wall and looked up at a patch of burnt orange sky that the pollution and distant city lights painted on the horizon. There was an enormity there that he wasn't equipped to process efficiently, and this inefficiency disturbed him in a physical way, almost like a pressure in the center of his chest that he normally associated with poorly prepared meetings or contracts with ambiguous clauses. But this wasn't a contract. This was a family. 3 people in a space that would barely fit in one of the bathrooms of his Upper East Side apartment. A sick woman in a bed, a daughter who worked by day in his hotel and by night at a job no one paid her for, a teenager washing dishes with cracked hands in a basin of cold water. And between the 3 of them, sustaining everything, was one salary, a single salary. The salary he was about to cut off permanently that afternoon, when his hand had stopped in the air with the pen a millimeter from the paper. Clara walked out through a door that Nathan imagined led to a small back area. He heard the sound of running water and concluded she was washing the used bandages or discarding something. He had maybe 2 or 3 minutes before she returned. It was enough for him to make the only decision that made sense at that moment. He moved away from the wall, adjusted his blazer, took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the side of the house where the sound of water indicated Clara was. When he turned the corner, he saw her back, leaning over a cement basin, scrubbing her hands under a thin stream of water coming from an old faucet. She didn't hear him arrive. The dirt ground muffled any footsteps. Nathan stopped 10 feet away and said her name in a low voice. "Clara." She spun around in a sharp movement, eyes wide, her whole body recoiling instinctively until she hit the basin. In the brief space of 2 seconds, Nathan saw a sequence of emotions pass across her face that he had never catalogued on any face before. Surprise, terror, shame, despair, resignation. It was like watching an entire person collapse inside, while the exterior desperately tries to maintain a shape. "I didn't come to accuse you," he said, before she could speak. His voice came out with a calmness that surprised Nathan himself, because inside he was anything but calm. Inside, it felt like that state right before a storm, when the air is heavy and still, and the sky changes color in a way that isn't exactly beautiful, but is impossible to ignore. Clara didn't respond. She was leaning against the basin with her hands squeezed together, her eyes glistening with the kind of moisture that hasn't fallen yet, but can no longer be held back. Nathan took a step to the side, not closer, but to move away from her path to the exit, signaling she wasn't trapped there. It was a small gesture. She noticed. "I followed you tonight," he continued, "and I know that's invasive. It wasn't a decision I'm proud of. But before signing the paper that reached my desk this afternoon, I needed to understand what was behind what was written." Clara closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, there was a resolve in them that Nathan recognized as that of someone who has nothing left to lose and therefore sees no reason to keep pretending. "You've seen it then," she said. Her voice was firm, but firm in the way it sounds when all available energy is used just to keep it from shaking, leaving nothing for anything else. "I have," Nathan confirmed. There was a silence. Inside, the teenager was still making some noise with dishes or a pot. The tree branches swayed slightly with the wind that had begun to blow, and the leaves made a dry rustle that echoed in the small yard. "So you know," Clara said, and this time her voice wasn't firm enough. She broke down. It wasn't a dramatic sob. It was the kind of thing that happens when someone carries a weight for too long, and someone appears out of nowhere and says they saw it, simply saw it, and that acknowledgement is enough for the weight to fall all at once because there is finally someone there to witness it. She didn't cover herself with her hands, didn't hunch over, didn't run. She stood still against the basin and cried with the quietness of someone who has already learned that crying loudly does no good. Nathan stood still. He didn't approach. He let her. After a few moments, she took 3 deep breaths, wiped her face with the cuff of her blouse and began to speak. And once she started, she didn't stop. She spoke about her mother's illness, about the ulcers that appeared 2 years ago and kept getting worse without proper treatment, because the local clinic had a 2-month wait for a specialist, and the right medicine cost an amount she couldn't save without missing another bill. She spoke about the salary that ended before the month did, about the electric bill that had come with a total she didn't understand, and that ate what was left for a week. She spoke about the shoes for Matthew, her son, which were 2 sizes too small, and which he hadn't complained about, but which she had noticed by the way he walked. She spoke about the private medical consultations she had tried once, and the doctor had said her mother needed specific treatment, with medications not provided by the local public system, and that the bill was an amount she looked at on the paper, and then looked at the doctor, and then looked at the paper again, and folded the paper and put it in her bag, and said nothing because there was nothing she could say. Nathan listened to everything without interrupting once, and every word from that woman in the dark yard deposited itself in a place inside him that for a long time had received absolutely nothing. When Clara finished speaking, the silence that remained wasn't the empty kind. It was the full kind, full of all the words she had carried alone for months and that now, finally released into the air, seemed to occupy the space in a visible, almost material way, as if they were solid enough to be touched. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, still in a low voice, that he would like to go into the house if she would allow it. Not to verify anything, not to document anything, just to go in. Clara looked at him as if she were trying to find the trap in that request, and Nathan understood that this reflex was fair. She had every reason in the world to distrust a man who had arrived suddenly on a Tuesday night at the end of an alley that didn't appear on maps, and who had watched her life through the window before announcing himself. Anyone with any degree of sense would be suspicious. The fact that she was considering letting him in was in itself a measure of the desperation that had overcome the distrust. "You can come in," she said after a moment. Nathan followed her through the back door. The interior of the room was even smaller than he had estimated from the outside. A single improvised plywood partition separated the space into two ill-defined areas: the area where the elderly woman's bed was, and a one-burner stove on a wooden table, and a part further back where there was a mattress on the floor against the wall, a pair of slippers beside it, and a nail in the wall with a school backpack hanging from it. On the walls, damp stains drew involuntary maps over the peeling plaster. The tin roof had been partially reinforced from the inside with pieces of styrofoam and plastic, a handmade attempt to contain the cold that came through the cracks. The teenager was sitting on the floor next to the stove, with his back against the wall and a notebook open on his lap. When Nathan entered, he stood up quickly, not out of reverence, but out of a protective instinct, placing his body slightly forward as if creating a barrier between the stranger and his grandmother in the bed. "It's okay, Matthew," Clara said to her son, and in those 3 words was all the weight of a mother trying to maintain normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. The boy looked at Nathan with that expression Nathan had seen through the window, that precocious and serious maturity that had no aggression, but had a very clear determination. Then he took a step back and sat back down on the floor, but kept his eyes on the visitor. Nathan walked slowly to the center of the room. He looked at everything: the bed, the stove, the mattress, the backpack, the walls. On an improvised shelf of 3 boards was a row of medicines, some in pharmacy packaging, others in loose pills in an open shoebox. There was also a photo taped to the wall next to the window, a photo printed on plain paper, faded, of a younger Clara with a baby in her lap and an older woman beside her, smiling at the camera with their eyes closed from smiling so hard. Nathan stopped in front of the photo for a second that lasted longer than a second. Then he turned to the bed. The elderly woman had woken up with the movement. Her eyes were open, 2 dark, deep eyes that carried the intensity of someone who spent their life paying attention to people, because paying attention to people was the only tool they had. She looked at Nathan with a calmness that was not at all indifference. It was the calmness of someone who has seen much and learned that reacting in haste is always worse than waiting to understand. "Good evening, ma'am," Nathan said. "Good evening, young man," the elderly woman replied with a voice that had lost volume but hadn't lost firmness. Nathan stood beside the bed, not knowing exactly what he had thought would happen at that moment. He had entered without a plan, without a script, without the structure he normally put into everything he did. It was completely unknown territory, and he was in it in sneakers and a $3,000 blazer, like a traveler who forgot the map at home and only realized after being too far away to turn back. The elderly woman continued looking at him, and then, with a slowness that seemed deliberate, she slightly narrowed her eyes. It wasn't pain, it was recognition. "You're Edward's son," she said. It wasn't a question. Nathan stood frozen. "You have the same forehead as him. That line here," she raised a trembling finger and pointed to her own forehead between her eyebrows. "Edward had that line since he was young. He looked like that when he was thinking hard, just like you now." His father's name in the middle of that scene, in that room on that night, had the effect of a stone thrown into still water. Nathan felt the ripples expanding, even before he understood where the stone had come from. "How do you know me?" he said, and his voice came out differently, lower, more cautious. The elderly woman smiled with a fatigue that was also gentle. "I know you, Nathan. I remember when you didn't even reach the height of this bed, when you would wake up in the middle of the night with a nightmare and go knock on the kitchen door because you were afraid of waking your father. Nathan didn't breathe for a moment. She continued. Your father traveled a lot. Your mother left when you were 3. It was just me, Martha. I was the housekeeper at the house in Westchester. I stayed almost 20 years in that house. Mrs. Gable, Nathan said, and the name came out of his mouth with a texture different from any word he had pronounced that night, with weight, with history, with that smell of rice and beans that had appeared from the depths of his memory when he passed through the neighborhood, and that now finally made sense. The very one, she said. Clara watched from a distance, with her arms crossed and an expression Nathan couldn't completely read because he was looking at his employee's mother, at the woman who had just said she was Mrs. Gable, and trying to fit together the pieces of something that had begun to assemble inside him in an accelerated and painful way. Mrs. Gable had worked at his father's house for almost 20 years. She had given him milk at night when his father was traveling. She had taken him to school when the nanny was absent. She had been there for the falls, the nightmares, the afternoons of schoolwork. She had been, with all the honesty the fact deserved, the most constant person of his childhood in a period when constancy was the rarest and most precious asset a 3-year-old boy could have. And Nathan Montgomery had arrived that night at the end of an unlit alley, following an employee he was about to fire, and had found Mrs. Gable on a narrow bed with her legs covered in ulcers, being cared for with materials taken from his own hotel because there was nothing else. He slowly lowered himself until he was at eye level with the bed. He stayed with his knees a few inches from the cold cement floor and looked at that face that illness had transformed, but that now, up close, from a proximity that security cameras would never have, he recognized. He recognized the line of the eyes, the shape of the hands on the sheet, the way she kept her head slightly tilted to the side when she paid attention to someone. He recognized her. And this recognition arrived like water filling a space that was already ready to be filled, and he did nothing to stop it because suddenly there was no more energy or reason to do so. Mrs. Gable, he began, and didn't finish, because his voice failed. And Nathan Montgomery, who had built an entire empire on the strength of not failing, knelt beside a humble bed with a broken voice and eyes full of something that hadn't come out in a long time. The elderly woman reached out with effort and touched her fingertips to the back of his hand. A small, simple gesture, the kind she had made countless times with that same boy decades ago, when his world had shrunk until it fit in the space between a bed and a nightmare-filled dawn. "Now you're here," she said. "That's already something." And Nathan, for the first time in more years than he could count, didn't know what to answer. He just stayed. And that was enough for that moment. Matthew had dropped his notebook and stood by the plywood partition, observing the scene with that careful attention that was the hallmark of his face. Clara hadn't moved from where she was, standing against the wall by the door, her arms still crossed but with less tension now, her body having yielded some of its initial defensive rigidity. It was as if Nathan's presence beside her mother's bed, kneeling and silent, had disarmed something she had carried armed for protection for too long. Mrs. Gable withdrew her hand slowly. Her fingers returned to the top of the sheet with the slow movement of someone managing their available energy well. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, like someone organizing a collection of thoughts before deciding which ones to show. "You have the face of someone who wants to ask a lot of things and doesn't know where to start," she said, without looking at him, with that half-dry, half-affectionate tone that Nathan now remembered as Mrs. Gable's signature in every situation where he had come to her with some unresolved confusion. "I do," he admitted. She turned her head to him. "Then ask. We don't have forever." Nathan was silent for a moment. Then he said direct, because despite everything, that was still how he functioned. "Why are you like this? Why didn't you seek help before? Why didn't I know you were here?" Mrs. Gable opened a smile that had more history than joy. "Those are 3 different questions with the same answer," she said. "Then give me that answer." She took a deep breath. Her chest rose with effort and fell slowly. The illness came slowly, as this illness always does. First a wound here, an inflammation there. I treated it as I could with what I had. Then it got worse and what I had became less. As for seeking help, she paused. Help from whom, Nathan? Who was I going to seek? The question hung in the air with the density of something that didn't need an answer, because the answer was obvious, and exactly for that reason, it was uncomfortable. Nathan remained silent. Mrs. Gable continued. Your mother left when you were 3. Your father, God forgive me, was a man occupied with his own things. The people who knew me were those from the house, those from the old neighborhood, people who dispersed over time, as always happens. My daughter here, she looked at Clara with an affection that had the texture of something built over years of shared difficulty. She does what she can. She does more than she can. But what she can has never been enough for what the situation asks, and that isn't her fault. I know, Nathan said. You know now, she corrected without malice. Before you didn't know because there was no reason for you to know. You had your life, your company, your hotels. I heard you went far. I was happy when I heard. Nathan looked at her. Who told you? She didn't answer immediately. She shifted her gaze to the window, to that faded floral curtain that filtered the weak light of the room's single bulb. It was the look of someone deciding how far to go. There was a woman here in the neighborhood, an older neighbor who spent some time working near Westchester. She brought me news sometimes. Said Edward's son was growing up well, that he had set up a business, that he was doing well. I was satisfied. A child doing well is a joy that doesn't grow old. Nathan swallowed hard. Mrs. Gable, he said carefully, and his voice returned to that firmness that was instrumental to him. But now the firmness was serving a different purpose. It was serving to help him not drop what he was still trying to hold. When you left my father's house, how was it? The silence that followed was of a different kind than the previous ones. It wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. The difference between those two silences Nathan had learned in years of negotiation was significant. A man who hesitates is still deciding. A man who prepares already knows what he's going to say and is just finding the right way to say it. Mrs. Gable found the way. I left because your father asked me to leave, she said, with great clarity, with words that left no room for interpretation. He said he was reorganizing the house, that he wouldn't need a live-in housekeeper anymore, that he thanked me for the years of service. He handed me an envelope. Nathan said nothing, but his gaze hardened in a way that Clara, from the corner where she was, noticed, and that made Matthew, who was also watching, slightly clench his jaw. The envelope had less than what was right to have, Mrs. Gable continued. I knew how much was right. I'm not a fool, Nathan. I worked almost 20 years in that house. I know what was due to me. What was in the envelope was little more than half of that. Nathan kept his gaze fixed on her. And you accepted it? She gave a small smile. Your father asked me not to create a problem. He used exactly that word, problem. He said that if I went the difficult route, things could get complicated for me in ways that would be better to avoid. I had my little daughter. She pointed discreetly to Clara with her chin. I had nothing to protect myself with except silence, so I left in silence. Nathan stood still. But inside, something had moved with a controlled violence he recognized. It was the same feeling he had when he discovered a partner had lied, when a contract had been tampered with, when someone had used a position of power to snatch from someone weaker what was not due to them. Only this time, it wasn't a partner. It wasn't a contract. It was his father. And I, he said. Did I know? Mrs. Gable looked at him with a clarity that had no accusation, but had no unnecessary pity either. For you were what, 12, 13? Your father told you I had retired and gone to live with relatives in the countryside. And you were a child. A child believes what their father tells them. That's natural. Nathan closed his eyes for a second. Behind his eyelids, he tried to remember. There was an afternoon, he must have been about 13, coming home from school and asking for Mrs. Gable because there was a science project she always helped him organize. His father had said she had retired and gone to the countryside to be with family. He had asked if he could call her. His father had said she didn't have a landline in the new town. And then, life had moved on, as life does. and Mrs. Gable's space had been filled by other things, other years, other stories, and her name had sunk to a place of memory that isn't quite forgetting, but functions similarly when no one triggers it for long enough. Until that night. Until a security report reached his hands with towels and antiseptic and gauze and the name of a woman he was about to fire. Nathan opened his eyes. He looked at Mrs. Gable. He looked at Clara. He looked at Matthew, who now had his hands in his pockets, and looked at the floor with an expression that had stopped being just vigilant and had become something closer to uncertain, like someone trying to evaluate if what was happening in that room was dangerous or something completely different that didn't yet have an accessible name. Nathan stood up slowly from the floor. His knees protested the cold of the cement, but he didn't show it. He stood up, straightened his blazer by instinct, and looked at Mrs. Gable for a moment that lasted as long as it needed to. "Tomorrow morning," he said, and his voice was different now, no longer cautious or low. It had a purpose. "There is a doctor who does home visits. She will be here at 8 a.m. Can it be at 8? Clara looked at him with the expression of someone who needs to ask if she's hearing right, but doesn't want to show she isn't. "It can be at 8, she said after a moment. Nathan nodded. He looked one last time at Mrs. Gable. The elderly woman watched him with those dark, deep eyes, and in the depths of them was something that wasn't surprise. It was as if she knew, with that specific knowledge of someone who spent years forming a child's character, that when that child finally faced the truth, he would do what was right. She had bet on it in silence and from a distance, for longer than was fair to have to bet on anything. "Good night, Mrs. Gable," he said. "Good night, Nathan," she replied. And then, with the kind of affection that needs no volume to be felt, "I'm glad you came." He walked out the door, crossed the alley, and walked back along the nameless street to the car. He sat at the wheel, closed the door, and looked ahead for a while without starting the engine. The city around him continued with its usual constant noise, but something inside him had reorganized itself in a way that wasn't reversible, and he knew it with the same certainty he knew how to balance a financial statement. The world he had left that morning was slightly different from the one waiting for him now, and the name of the person responsible for that difference, at least a significant part of it, was Edward Montgomery, his father. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He arrived at the apartment shortly before 11, took off his blazer, loosened his tie, and sat on the living room sofa with a glass of water he didn't drink. The 20th floor windows showed New York outside, a constellation of lights that never fully went out, a city that had built itself on top of itself so many times it no longer recognized itself whole from any angle. It was a city of overlaps, of things that existed at the same time without one knowing of the other. The Upper East Side and the nameless alley, his SUV and the crowded bus, the 7 hotels and the 1-burner stove. He thought of Edward Montgomery. He tried to recover the image of the father he had carried for years, not with affection, because their relationship had always been more functional than emotional, but with a kind of technical respect. Edward had built a fortune, had passed the tools of a business to his son, had taught the value of discipline and coldness in decisions. Nathan had taken those tools and multiplied them by 7. He had surpassed his father in practically every metric his father had defined as important. But there were other metrics, and in those, the image Nathan had carried for years began to show the cracks of a structure that had always been unstable beneath the surface. Mrs. Gable had left with less than half of what was due to her. His father had said she went to the countryside, a simple lie, easy to sustain because no one would go after the truth. No one had a reason, and Mrs. Gable, with her small daughter and without protection, had left in silence because that was what there was to do, when the only alternative was a confrontation with someone who had more power and who had made it clear, with a carefully chosen word, that problems could arise. Nathan stayed on the sofa until 2 in the morning. Then he went to his home office, opened his computer and began to work. Not on the hotel reports, not on the pending contracts. He opened a new document and began to write, with the methodology of someone assembling a structure. What had been done, what had been promised, what had been paid, what was due. A long account, covering almost 2 decades of service, with all the benefits that the law provided, and that the envelope delivered by Edward had left behind. He didn't have access to the original documents, but he had access to something better, an entire legal department that worked for him and that the next morning would receive a task Nathan had never imagined he would need to give. He slept 2 hours. He woke up at 6, made coffee himself, skipped the gym that day and went straight to the central office earlier than any of his employees. At 7:30, he had sent a message to Dr. Patricia Sterling, a specialist in chronic wounds he had met during a corporate health campaign months earlier, and whose contact had been saved in an email archive that had never been used. He gave the address of the alley, explained the case in basic medical terms, and asked if she could attend at 8 o'clock. She replied in 12 minutes, yes, she could. She would need authorization to prescribe and a guarantee of treatment costs. Nathan replied in 2, authorized and guaranteed. At 8:20, Sarah arrived at the office and found him in the room with 2 coffees on the desk and an open file on Martha Gable, former domestic employee of Edward Montgomery, which the legal department had pulled based on the few details Nathan had provided. The file was thin, as was to be expected of someone who had left the scene without a lawsuit, without a correctly recorded formal dismissal, without the documentary trail that a proper termination should leave. That in itself was information. "Sarah," Nathan said without preamble, "I need you to block my entire schedule starting Thursday. Internal meetings that aren't urgent, postpone. External meetings, negotiate rescheduling. Anything that can wait, waits." Sarah took notes without asking anything, which was one of the reasons she had become indispensable in 5 years. "One more thing," he continued. "The employee Clara Sanders from housekeeping. I want her contract reviewed today. Salary, benefits, everything. Bring me a revision proposal by noon." Sarah blinked the 2 times that were the maximum of her surprise. "Up or down?" "Up," Nathan said. "Way up." She left. Nathan returned to the file and spent the morning reviewing what had been possible to gather about Mrs. Gable's situation. The little that existed confirmed what she had told. An incompletely recorded termination, an indemnity value that didn't match the time of service, and a notation in his father's accounting office file, which Nathan still accessed for inheritance reasons, indicating the payment of a lump sum to a domestic employee under the generic heading of terminated services. The value on paper was exactly what Mrs. Gable had described, little more than half of what was legally due. Nathan closed the file. He stared at the blank screen for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called the labor law firm he had been under contract with since the first hotel. He asked to speak directly to the managing partner. The secretary said he was in a meeting. Nathan said he understood and would wait. 3 minutes later, the managing partner was on the line. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Nathan explained the case without going into personal details. A termination with a value below the legal amount, approximately 18 years ago. He wanted to know the possibilities for extrajudicial compensation and what time frame that could be structured in. The lawyer said that the statute of limitations was a sensitive point given the time, but there were paths. Nathan said he wasn't interested in paths. He was interested in doing the right thing, with or without the cover of the law. The lawyer, who had learned over years that when Nathan Montgomery said he was interested in something, it was usually a good idea not to try to convince him otherwise, said he would put together a proposal by the end of the day. At 11 in the morning, Nathan received a message from Dr. Sterling. She had visited the patient. The situation was serious but treatable with the correct protocol. She had left a complete prescription and would do weekly follow-ups. There was also a list of materials needed for home dressings, which with the right products would prevent future complications. Nathan replied, asking for the entire list to be delivered to the alley that very afternoon, that the cost would be fully covered, and that she could forward it directly to his assistant. After that, he sat in his chair for a moment, looking out the window at Fifth Avenue below with its cars and pedestrians and stories that passed without stopping. And he thought there were 2 things that needed to happen that very day. The first was a conversation with Clara Sanders, who was going to receive a proposal that would change the next years of her and her son's lives. The second was a conversation he had avoided for reasons that now seemed too small to justify the size of what had remained hidden behind them. A conversation with Edward Montgomery. His father lived in an apartment in the Upper West Side, 15 minutes from the office. Nathan had never shown up there without calling first. It wasn't the kind of relationship that allowed that kind of spontaneity. But there had also never been the kind of subject between them that Nathan needed to bring at that moment. And for that kind of subject, calling first would feel wrong in a way he couldn't name, but knew to be true. He wrote in the desk notepad, in his usual fast, slanted handwriting, 3 words: Clara, Father, Martha, in the order they needed to happen. Then he closed the notepad, stood up from his chair, and went to the window. The city was there, whole and fragmented at the same time, with its 7 hotels and its 1-burner stoves and its smoked glass panels and its faded floral curtains. And Nathan Montgomery, looking at it from the height of the 22nd floor, felt that the weight that had arrived the previous night was still there, firm and real on his shoulders, and that it wouldn't go away with any executive decision, with any approved report, with any pen signing a dotted line. That kind of weight only went away when you did what needed to be done, and he already knew what it was. Clara Sanders arrived for the afternoon shift, with that punctuality of someone who knows that 1 minute more or less can be the difference between keeping and losing. She clocked in at exactly 2 p.m., grabbed the cleaning cart in the service corridor, and began the usual route through the 12th floor of the Montgomery Grand Hotel, with the automated movements of someone who has traveled this path hundreds of times. But there was something different about her that afternoon. Not in her gestures, which were the same. It was a tension in her back, a lightness in her shoulders that wasn't lightness. It was the state of someone waiting for something to happen, and unable to decide if they want it to happen soon or if they'd prefer it to take a little longer. The doctor had gone to the house in the morning. Dr. Sterling had arrived exactly at 8, with a large case and a calm efficiency that Clara had recognized as the type of professional who doesn't need approval to know they are competent. She had examined Mrs. Gable for 40 minutes, had talked to her in a low voice, had explained everything she was going to do and why, and had left a detailed prescription and the promise to return the following week. At 3 in the afternoon, a delivery person had arrived with a large box of dressing materials, the prescribed medications, and a note inside saying only that everything had been provided and that there was nothing to worry about in that regard. Clara had stood with the box in her arms for a time she didn't know how to measure. Matthew had asked who had sent it. She had said it was the boss. And Matthew had become so quiet. She knew he was processing in the slow and serious way that was his hallmark, what that word meant in that context. She hadn't slept much the night before. She stayed awake reviewing the conversation in the yard, every word, every pause, every inflection of Nathan Montgomery's voice, trying to find the trap that must be there somewhere, because experience had taught her that when something seems too good to be the way it seems, it usually isn't. But she found no trap. She found only a man who had arrived without warning, and had listened without interrupting, and had left without making promises he couldn't keep, and who the next morning had sent a doctor and medicine and materials without asking for anything in return. It was a very large amount of nothing in return for her to be able to rest completely. She was cleaning the hallway of the 13th floor when Supervisor Martha Higgins' voice sounded on the internal communication radio. "Clara, please go up to the 22nd floor when you finish the hallway. Mr. Montgomery asked to see you." Clara stopped with the damp cloth in her hand. The supervisor used the word asked. Not ordered, not summoned. Asked. There was a difference, she noticed, and that kept reverberating while she folded the cloth, put it back in the cart, and walked to the service elevator. The 22nd floor was where the offices were. She had gone up there once on the day of her job interview just over a year ago. It was a completely different environment from the rest of the hotel she knew. The laundry, service corridors, employee break room and cleaning floors. There was carpet on the floor, art on the walls, air-conditioned silence, and that office light that isn't day or night but something in the middle. The assistant, a woman in her 30s with short hair and an efficiency visible even before she opened her mouth, met her at reception and took her directly to Nathan's office. She knocked twice on the door, opened it, and stayed outside. Nathan was standing by the window. He had left his blazer on a chair and had his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbow, which made him look slightly less formal and slightly more like a human being than the full-suited version Clara had seen in the alley. When she entered, he turned and pointed to the chair in front of the desk. "Sit down, Clara." She sat. He didn't go to the chair behind the desk. He stayed standing, leaning against the side, which she recognized as a gesture of equality, however unlikely, however calculated. It was the posture of someone who doesn't want the desk to be between them. "How is your mother today?" he asked. "Better," she said. "The doctor came early. My mother liked her very much, said she has a good hand." Nathan let a small smile appear, the kind that doesn't take up much space but is real. "Dr. Sterling is very good at what she does. She will continue follow-ups every week until the situation stabilizes completely. And if additional specialists are needed, we'll find them." Clara stared at him with that expression of someone waiting for the but. "There is no but," Nathan said, as if he had read her mind. She blinked. "I know it seems strange," he continued. "It's feeling a bit strange to me too, if you want to know. But sometimes the things that need to be done arrive wrapped in ways we weren't expecting, and what matters is what we do with them when they arrive." He went to the desk, opened a folder, and took out a document. He placed it in front of Clara with the page facing her. "This is a new employment contract. I want you to read it calmly. If you want to take it home to analyze it, do so. If you want to have a lawyer look at it, do that too. But I need you to know it's real, it's definitive, and there is no condition behind it." Clara looked at the paper. She read the first line, then the second. Then she stopped at the third for a time that was visibly longer than the previous ones. The value in the salary field was 3 times what she currently received. There was also a benefits field that included full family medical insurance, a substantial meal allowance, transportation assistance without deduction, and a line she read twice to be sure she was understanding. Full tuition scholarship for a dependent at a school partnered with the chain. She raised her eyes to Nathan. "Matthew," he said before she could ask, "I would like him to be able to go to a better school. There is an institution partnered with the hotel, with full high school, labs, tutoring, and individualized follow-up. If he wants it, the scholarship is his. No bureaucracy, just the enrollment." Clara stared at him for a long moment. There were many things in that look. There was doubt. There was gratitude, even before the gratitude made rational sense. There was the conditioned reflex of someone who learned that goodness without a price usually presents the bill later. But there was also, in a deeper place, that fragile and resilient thing that is hope, when it hasn't been entirely blunted by the hardness of daily life. "Why?" she asked. And it wasn't a suspicious question. It was an honest question from someone who needs to understand the root of something to be able to accept it entirely. Nathan was quiet for a second. "Because your mother took care of me when I was a child," he said. "Because what happened to her was unfair, and part of that injustice has to do with my family. Because what the report described as theft was the only way out you had found in a situation that shouldn't have reached the level it did. And because if I'm going to build hotels where people stay to rest and feel good, it makes perfect sense that the people who clean those hotels can have at least a minimum degree of dignity and rest in their own lives." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. A tear ran down the left side of her face, and she wiped it with her sleeve before it reached her chin, with that quick gesture of someone who doesn't want crying to take over. "There's one more thing," Nathan said more slowly now. "There is a situation I need to resolve with my father. It's directly related to your mother, to what happened when she left there. I'm not going to tell you everything now because I'm still organizing it, but I want you to know that whatever is done will be done with the knowledge and consent of Mrs. Gable. Nothing will happen without her knowing and agreeing." Clara looked at him with an attention that went beyond the surface of the conversation. "My mother never talked much about how it was," she said, "but I knew it hadn't been good. She arrived with little and never explained properly. And my mother isn't the type to fail to explain without a reason." Nathan nodded. "I know, and I'm going to fix it." She looked at the contract once more. Then she looked at him. "Can I sign now?" "You can, but you don't have to. Take it home if you want." She reached out for the pen on the desk. Nathan pushed it gently toward her. Clara Sanders signed the new contract in a firm script that was the most decisive thing she had done in months, maybe years, and when she placed the pen back on the desk, there was something different in the posture of her shoulders. It wasn't complete relief, but it was the beginning of something that relief would become, in time. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the contract, for going there, for staying to listen." Nathan nodded. "Thank you for telling me." She stood up, folded the copy of the contract he had set aside for her, put it in her bag, and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned. "She always spoke well of you, my mother. When I was little, she sometimes mentioned a boy at the house where she worked who was too curious for his own good. Said he would be someone." Nathan stared at the closed door for a moment after she left. Then he went back to the window and looked out at the city. The first two lines of the notepad were crossed out. Clara and Martha. Only the father remained. And that was the longest conversation on the list. Edward Montgomery was 64 years old and had the appearance of a man who had decided to age with authority. White hair combed back with that precision that requires a mirror and attention, clothes always of high quality. Even on days he didn't leave the house, the posture of someone who learned early on that the body also communicates hierarchy. He had partially retired 3 years earlier when he passed the management of the hotel chain to his son, but partially retired was an expression he himself detested because it suggested incompleteness, and Edward Montgomery didn't like anything that suggested incompleteness. He lived in the Upper West Side apartment with a housekeeper who came 3 times a week and a Persian cat named Augustus, who completely ignored his owner's attempts at companionship. Edward's life had the organization of someone who built their own rules and had enough power never to need to abandon them. He had dinner at 7, went to bed at 10, had the same breakfast for 20 years, and read the print newspaper because the digital version annoyed him for a reason he couldn't quite articulate. When the doorbell rang at 8:20 p.m., he was in the living room armchair with his nightly glass of scotch and the book of the week. He stood up slowly, went to the intercom, and heard his son's voice. "Nathan? Hey, Dad, can I come up? Can I come?" Edward stood with the intercom in his hand for a second. Nathan never showed up without warning. In 20 years of his son's adult life, Edward couldn't remember a single time that had happened. That fact alone was enough for him to press the button to release the elevator and walk to the door. When Nathan entered, Edward noticed immediately that something was different. Not in the blazer, not in the posture, not in the expression of functional coldness the son had cultivated since he was a teenager. It was something deeper, like when a structure is intact on the outside, but internally has already reorganized around a new center of gravity. "What's up?" Edward asked, because a direct question was the language they communicated in best, the only neutral ground they had found to exist near each other without the space becoming too charged. Nathan entered the living room, looked at the armchair where his father had been sitting, at the glass of scotch, at Augustus the cat in the window ignoring them with aristocratic indifference, and then stood in the center of the room without sitting. "I need to ask you something," he said. Edward went to the armchair, placed the book on the side table, and stood up as well, instinctively, because sitting in front of his standing son seemed like a position he didn't want to take at that moment without knowing what was coming. "Questions," he said. "Does the name Martha Gable mean anything to you?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Nathan counted. 4 seconds was enough time to answer any question about anyone you genuinely didn't remember. When the silence lasts 4 seconds, it's because the person remembers, but is deciding what to do with it. Edward said in a controlled voice, "Mrs. Gable. She worked in our house for many years. Why are you asking?" "Because I saw her yesterday," Nathan said. "She's in a bed with legs covered in ulcers that need specialized treatment, living in a 12-square-yard room in a neighborhood that doesn't appear on my GPS maps. Her daughter works at my hotel and was being removed from her job for taking gauze and antiseptic to dress her mother's wounds because she had no way to buy them." Edward said nothing. He stared at his son with that expression Nathan had learned as a child not to try to decipher, an expression that revealed nothing because it had been trained to reveal nothing. "You said she had retired and gone to the countryside," Nathan continued. "I was 13. I believed it. Why would I doubt it? But she didn't go to the countryside, Dad. She stayed in the city, and she left there with less than half of what was her legal right because you asked her to leave in silence. and she went because she had no choice. Edward walked to the window. He stood with his back turned for a moment. Outside, the neighborhood had its usual nightly rhythm, cars passing, a pizzeria lit up on the corner, the distant sound of music from a neighboring apartment. Things were different back then, he said. Nathan looked at him. Simpler, Edward continued. Labor relations were different. What was paid was what was possible to pay at that moment. No, Nathan said, and his voice didn't rise in volume but became denser. It wasn't what was possible, it was what you chose to pay. There is a huge difference between the two, and you know it. You've always known it. Edward turned around, and there was something on his father's face that Nathan had rarely seen, something his father had struggled all his life not to show his son, because showing was a way of losing, and Edward Montgomery didn't lose. It was discomfort. The specific kind of discomfort that comes from being confronted with a truth one has spent years filing away out of reach of daily consciousness. She asked not to create a problem, Edward said. She asked because you made it clear that creating a problem would be worse for her, Nathan replied. That isn't her asking. That is someone being silenced because the other side has more power. Edward stared at his son. And the story about her going to the countryside? Edward opened his mouth and closed it, opened it again. It was simpler that way. For you, for the organization of the house, so I wouldn't have to keep explaining to people. So you wouldn't have to explain to me, Nathan said. Edward Montgomery was quiet. She gave me milk at night when you traveled, Nathan continued. And this time there was something in his voice that wasn't accusation. It was an inventory. It was the voice of someone counting what is due before deciding what to do with the bill. She took me to school when the nanny was out. She was part of my life for 10 years, from 3 to 13, and when she left I couldn't even say goodbye because you said she had traveled. And what she received for that was less than half of what was hers by law, plus a request for silence. Edward walked slowly to the sofa and sat down. It was the first time in a long time Nathan had seen him sit like that, not with the posture of someone choosing a chair, but with the posture of someone who needs one. I knew she was here, Edward said after a moment, on a general level. Not where, not how, but I knew she had stayed in the city. And you didn't go after her? No, Edward said. I didn't. The answer hung in the air between them with all the weight it carried. Nathan stood in the center of the room for a long moment. Then he said, with a clarity that had no high volume, but had all the firmness he had built over 32 years as a professional tool, and that he was now using for a completely different purpose. I'm going to do the following. The law firm is putting together a calculation of what was due to her at the time, adjusted and with interest, multiplied by what is fair considering the time that has passed and what that time cost her. It will be a significant amount. I'm going to pay it now and then. I'm going to charge you, Dad. Not financially, because money between us was never the problem, but I need you to go to her personally and ask for forgiveness. Edward looked at him. A face-to-face apology, Nathan continued. Her looking at you and you looking at her. No intermediary, no message sent, no envelope sent by mail. If you don't do this, I have nothing more to say to you after tonight. The silence that followed was the longest of the night. Edward stared at his son with an expression Nathan couldn't completely read, and which had too many layers to all surface in a few seconds. There was pride, there was defensiveness, there was something that could be shame. And there was also, in a very old corner of that expression, something that looked like the recognition of someone who always knew a bill would be presented someday, and had prayed in silence that the day would take longer. The day had arrived, and Nathan Montgomery had presented the bill with the same coldness of someone signing financial reports before breakfast, except this time there was something different in that coldness. There was, beneath it, an amount of feeling he hadn't yet fully learned to name, but that he knew was real. And real was enough to keep standing where he was, looking at his father, waiting for an answer that would change the course of everything that came after. Edward Montgomery didn't answer that night. He said he needed to think. He said it with that voice that had commanded boardrooms and signed contracts and directed an entire family in the direction he judged correct, and which now came out smaller, not weaker but smaller, like when you turn down the volume on something, to be able to hear better what's underneath. Nathan heard the need to think, nodded, grabbed the blazer he had placed over the back of a chair at the entrance, and left without a formal goodbye, because a formal goodbye in that context would be a falsity neither of them asked for. He went down in the elevator and stood in the building's lobby for a moment, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the marble floor of the hall. The doorman watched him from afar with the well-trained discretion of someone working in a high-end building who knows that part of the salary is paid also for not seeing certain things. Nathan wasn't worried about the doorman. He was organizing in that small silence of the lobby what had just happened and what might or might not happen from then on. There was a version of Edward Montgomery that Nathan knew well, the version that calculated, that managed, that found the most efficient way out of any problem. This version would have processed the ultimatum as a risk variable and made the most advantageous decision. But there was another version of Edward that Nathan knew less, the older version, prior to the businessman and the distant father, the version that had, at some point in life, made decisions that weren't completely defensible and had built around them an architecture of justifications that over time had hardened until it seemed solid. This older version was the one that would need to yield in that situation, and Nathan didn't know if it still had enough mobility for that, but he had said what there was to say. The rest was up to Edward. In the next 2 days, Nathan dove into work with an intensity that was both genuine and strategic. The way he had developed over the years of using the concrete and the measurable as an anchor when what was to be resolved was too vague and human to fit into a spreadsheet. He approved the spa renovation project for the Jersey Shore Hotel, resolved a pending contractual issue with a beverage supplier for the 18th floor restaurant, and had a long meeting with the Human Resources Department that had initiated the process of a general review of benefits for all employees in the chain, not just Clara Sanders. That meeting had started with a simple request from Nathan. I want to understand how the people who work for me live. Not in terms of performance, not in terms of productivity metrics. I want to understand what they need and what we are failing to offer. The HR manager, a methodical man in his mid-40s named George, had blinked several times before starting to answer, because that type of question was not Nathan Montgomery's usual repertoire. But he had answered, and what he answered was revealing. 23% of the chain's employees didn't have health insurance for dependents. 38% had no access to any type of basic legal support. 21% had stated in the annual internal survey that they had difficulties with transportation during night shifts. None of this information had reached Nathan's desk before because no one had considered that it should. Nathan listened to everything, asked precise questions, and at the end of the meeting said, "By the end of the month, I need a proposal for a benefit structure that resolves each of these points, with detailed costs. If the cost is reasonable, we approve. If it's high, we approve anyway and review the margin elsewhere." George left the meeting with the expression of someone recalibrating the idea they had of their own employer. On the afternoon of the second day, Nathan received a call from the law firm with the complete calculation of what was due to Martha Gable. The number was significant, 2 years of unpaid difference in the original termination, with all legal charges, plus an estimated compensation for the impact that difference had generated over the years. The lawyer had done a meticulous job and had reached a value that, multiplied by 10 as Nathan had internally determined, represented an amount that Mrs. Gable and her daughter had never imagined having access to in their lives. Nathan approved the amount that afternoon. He authorized the transfer to an account that Clara would help open in her mother's name, with a linked fund that would guarantee a monthly income for the rest of the elderly woman's life, independent of any other condition. Then he called Clara and informed her. The call lasted 8.5 minutes, of which approximately 3 were silence on her end, the kind that isn't silence from a lack of words, but silence from an excess of them, when what one feels is too big to fit into anything one can manage to say. On the afternoon of the third day, Nathan was on the balcony of his apartment with a coffee when the phone rang. It was Edward. The conversation was short. Edward said he had thought, said he wanted to go, said he needed an address. Nathan stood with the phone in his hand for a moment after hanging up. There was something that wasn't complete relief, but was the anteroom of relief, that state where the structure that was tense begins to release pressure, before relaxing for good. He called Clara immediately. He explained that his father wanted to visit Mrs. Gable. He asked her to ask her mother if she agreed to receive him. He said there was no obligation, that if the answer was no, it would be no, and that there would be other ways to resolve the situation, without Mrs. Gable needing to see someone who had caused her harm if she didn't want to. Clara said she would ask and get back to him. She returned the call in 40 minutes. My mother said yes. She said that those who left must be able to return if they want, because the door of the house belongs to the owner of the house, not the visitor. Nathan was silent for a second. She is extraordinary, he said. She is, Clara agreed with a voice that had pride and fatigue in equal proportions. Always has been. They scheduled the visit for Saturday morning. Nathan sent the address to his father with a short message, Saturday at 10, no more text. Edward replied with a simple, fine, which was the first time in many years Nathan had received such a direct word from his father, devoid of any additional layer of meaning. On Friday night, Nathan went to the alley. He hadn't warned Clara, but she opened the door without surprise, as if somehow she already expected him to show up before Saturday. Mrs. Gable was sitting in bed with an additional pillow that had arrived along with the medical supplies, which allowed her to keep her head slightly elevated, something Dr. Sterling had indicated was important for circulation. Her legs were covered with new clean bandages, applied with the proper material, and there was an already visible difference in the skin color around the wounds, less inflamed than Nathan had seen 2 days earlier. She saw him enter and said, with that voice that had lost volume but hadn't lost affection, "Came to see me before the big show tomorrow." Nathan sat in the low chair Clara had placed next to the bed, probably anticipating that visit even without being warned. It was the kind of detail Clara did without explanation, with the same naturalness with which she had cared for her mother for years, without anyone asking or thanking her enough. "Mrs. Gable," he said, "my father is coming tomorrow. I needed to know if you are prepared for this, not what you told me over the phone, through what Clara told me. I want to know what you are feeling now, personally." The elderly woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window where the floral curtain was pulled back and let in a piece of cold, golden afternoon. "I've carried this story for a long time, Nathan," she said. "Anger is heavy. Bitterness too. I won't say I didn't have both. I did, and for years. But there comes a point where the weight becomes greater than the strength you have to carry it, and then you have to choose. Either you drop the weight or it knocks you down. I chose to drop it some time ago. Not for him, for me." Nathan listened to her. "What I want from tomorrow isn't revenge. It's not seeing him arrive and humiliate himself so I feel better. I want to see if there's still someone real inside that man, because if there is, then it was worth something. And if there isn't, I already knew that, and at least I'll be sure." Nathan nodded slowly. "You are wiser than anyone I've ever sat down to listen to at a business table." Mrs. Gable gave a small, tired, real smile. "Business is easier than people, boy. People are the hardest work there is. And you're learning that very late, but you are learning." He stayed for another hour. Matthew arrived from school with his backpack on his back and stood in the entrance with less suspicion than the first time, looking at Nathan with that seriousness that was his face's mark. Nathan asked how the day had been. Matthew said fine, and then after a pause said there was a history subject that was difficult because the teacher taught too fast. Nathan said there was a very good app for history and that if he wanted, he could send the name. Matthew said he could send it. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning, and a beginning was what there was to work with at that moment. Saturday dawned with that New York light in May, a light that is neither hot nor cold, but has a specific clarity that seems more honest than the light of other months, as if autumn in the city had the decency to show things exactly as they are, without the filter of any more dramatic season. Nathan arrived at the alley at 9:45. He had told his father to show up at 10. He wanted to be there before, not to supervise, but because there was something he needed to check inside before Edward arrived. That Mrs. Gable was well, that Clara was ready, that the environment had the minimum serenity for a difficult conversation to happen without the additional weight of an environment in crisis. Clara had cleaned the room. There were no miracles possible with 12 square yards and damp walls, but there was a different order in the space. Things in the right places, the smell of brewed coffee still in the air, natural window light coming in without the curtain in front. Mrs. Gable was sitting in bed with a fresh sheet, her hair tied back, her hands on her lap. She had dressed up to receive the visit with the dignity of someone who knows that dignity doesn't need a perfect setting to exist. Matthew had left earlier at his mother's discreet request to visit a friend in the neighborhood. It was a planned absence with the care of someone who understands, without needing explanation, that there are moments for adults and moments for young people, and that mixing the two can complicate both. Nathan sat in the low chair next to the bed and was silent with Mrs. Gable for a few minutes. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have already established some degree of trust, even if built quickly and under unlikely circumstances. At 6 minutes past 10, footsteps were heard in the alley. Clara went to the door. Nathan stayed where he was. He heard his father's voice low, greeting Clara with a formality that had beneath it the kind of care of someone trying to do something right they weren't sure how to do. He heard Clara respond briefly. He heard the steps enter. Edward Montgomery appeared at the entrance of the room. He was in simpler clothes than Nathan had seen him in for years, slacks and a shirt without a tie, which for Edward was the equivalent of arriving barefoot in any other context. He had done this deliberately, Nathan realized. It was a choice, one of the first small but correct choices the father had made in that process. Edward stood at the entrance for a moment. His eyes met Mrs. Gable's in the bed, and what passed across his face at that moment was something Nathan had never seen on that face, something that wasn't disguisable, that didn't have enough barrier to be contained, that reached the surface with the speed and gentle violence of something that had been submerged for a long time. Edward swallowed hard. He walked slowly toward the bed. He stood looking at her for a moment, and then lowered himself to his knees with an effort that wasn't just physical, and which Nathan watched in silence from the corner where he sat. "Martha," Edward said. His voice came out rough. Mrs. Gable looked at him with those dark, deep eyes that had learned over decades to see what was inside people, more than what was on the surface. "Edward," she said, and there was no coldness in that name. There was the recognition of someone looking at someone they knew in other versions, in other times, and who realizes that time has done its work on both sides. Edward stayed on his knees, and then came the crying. Not the controlled crying of someone managing an emotion for strategic purposes, not the performative crying of someone who wants to be seen crying. It was the crying of a 64-year-old man who had built an entire life on the ability not to cry, and who had arrived on a Saturday in May in a 12-square-yard room and discovered that he no longer had enough strength to keep not crying. He asked for forgiveness, with whole words, not with euphemisms, not with justifications, that transformed the error into context and the context into a mitigating factor. He said he had done wrong. He said he had paid less than was her right and had asked for silence because it was more convenient for him. He said he had lied to his son about what had happened. He said he had known, on a general and cowardly avoided level, that she had stayed in the city, and that he had chosen not to know more than that because more than that would weigh on him, and he hadn't wanted the weight. Mrs. Gable heard it all, without interrupting, without confirming aloud, without denying. She heard with the quietness of someone finally receiving the bill for a debt they had lost hope of seeing collected, and who discovers that receiving that bill, even years later, even when the damage is already done, has something of healing. When Edward finished, he remained silent on his knees, his head slightly bowed with a vulnerability Nathan had never seen in his father, and which hit him in a way he didn't expect. Not with pity, not with satisfaction, but with that specific feeling of watching a human being finally do something they should have done before, and which, being done now, is not useless. Mrs. Gable reached out. She touched her fingertips to Edward's shoulder. "I forgive you," she said. And it wasn't fast, it was slow, with the weight of a decision that had been made deep in her heart long before that moment, and which was being put into the air now because the air was ready to receive it. "Not for you, Edward. I forgive for me." Because grudge weighs more than any illness, and I already carry enough weight to carry that too. Edward raised his eyes to her. I don't ask you to forget, she continued. I don't ask to pretend it wasn't, it was. And it hurt, and it still hurts in a corner that has no medicine for that kind of pain. But what is done, and what can be done now can still be done. So I forgive. And I ask that you leave here and live in a way that the forgiveness is worth something. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them that Nathan recognized from the safe distance where he sat as the beginning of something. Not complete redemption, because complete redemption is the beautiful narrative that life rarely offers. It was the beginning of a person who decides to be a little different from what they had been, because they were finally confronted with the real cost of what they had been. Clara was leaning against the back wall, her arms crossed and her eyes shining, but she didn't cry. There was a determination in her face that Nathan had learned to recognize as the mark of someone who spent years being the only support for something enormous and who hadn't yet completely unlearned how to lean on more than themselves. Edward stood up slowly. He looked at Mrs. Gable once more. He said he would come again if she allowed it. She said that the door of the house belonged to the owner, the same phrase she had said to Nathan through Clara's report, and Edward understood what that meant, just as Nathan had understood. It was a yes with wisdom, not a yes with enthusiasm, but a real yes. Then Edward turned to Clara. He said he knew there were words that should be said to her as well, that what had happened to her mother had been a weight Clara had carried without responsibility, and that he regretted it. Clara listened. She didn't say it was fine, she didn't say everything was instantly forgivable. She said she heard him. And for now, hearing him was what there was. Edward left. His footsteps faded in the alley. Nathan stayed a while longer. There was nothing to say that silence didn't say better. The morning light had shifted angle and now came through the window without the curtain in a golden band that rested on Mrs. Gable's sheet and on her hands, which were open in her lap now, not closed as before, not holding anything, just open. It was a small position, but it had the name of someone who finally laid down a weight that was ready to be laid down. And in that 12-square-yard room on a Saturday in May, something that had been crooked for a long time began, with all the slowness that this type of thing requires, to take a shape closer to what it should have been from the beginning. 3 months passed with the specific speed that time has when it is full of things that matter. Not the speed of emptiness, which seems slow but leaves no trace. The speed of content, which passes fast but leaves marks that endure. The Montgomery Grand Hotel had in that period the same white marble facade and smoked glass on Fifth Avenue. Luxury cars continued stopping at the entrance, doormen continued greeting guests with characteristic discreet efficiency, and the 2 18th-floor restaurants continued serving the dishes that had earned them glowing mentions in the city's main guides. The surface was the same, but there were things happening inside that didn't appear in the lobby and weren't in the guides. The program had started as a proposal from the HR department, built based on the meeting Nathan had called weeks earlier, and had grown during the following months with a speed that surprised even George, the methodical manager who had blinked several times during the original meeting, before understanding that Nathan was serious. The full family medical plan had been implemented first, because it was of the most immediate and urgent impact. Then came the emergency fund, available to any employee who found themselves in a critical situation, without needing a long bureaucratic process, and the educational scholarships, which covered everything from the children's elementary school to the employee's own higher and technical courses. The free legal assistance had been the most unexpected addition for the employees. Many of them had never had access to a lawyer for any issue, from rental contracts to custody disputes or document regularization. The presence of a team of partner lawyers available twice a week in a room adapted in the hotel's basement had created, in the first weeks, a line that George had taken to Nathan as evidence that the demand was much greater than anyone had estimated. Nathan had looked at the line and said, "Double the available days." In the second month, the initiative had spread to the other 6 hotels in the chain. Each unit adapted the model to its local reality with the specificities of each city, but the core was the same: health, education, emergency, law. the 4 columns Nathan had written on a simple sheet on the afternoon he had returned from his father's apartment and spent hours sitting on the balcony organizing what he had learned in the previous 2 weeks. Clara Sanders had been the first person to know the program would exist, even before it had a name. Nathan had called her while still in the planning phase to ask, with an honesty she had recognized and matched in kind, what she thought a hotel employee really needed and that no employer usually offered. She had talked for 45 minutes without stopping, with concrete examples drawn from her own experience and the experience of colleagues she had known for years, and each of those examples had become an item on the list Nathan had passed to George the next morning. In the 3rd month, when the program was in full operation in all units and the first results were beginning to appear in internal organizational climate surveys, Nathan called an expanded meeting with all the chain's managers. It was a different meeting from the previous ones. There were no occupancy spreadsheets, no revenue targets, no growth projections. There was only one point on the agenda: the name of the program. The managers had presented corporate suggestions, most with the word Montgomery in some position, some with the name of the hotel, one with the word legacy. Nathan listened to them all, and then he said the program would be called the Martha Program. There was a silence in the room. None of the managers knew the name. None of them had participated in what had happened in those weeks leading up to the program's creation. George, who knew a little more than the others from being the first summoned, stayed quiet with the expression of someone who understands there is a story behind it, and that this story is not to be told at that meeting. Nathan didn't explain. He only said the name was in honor of a woman who had taught, without ever intending to teach, what truly mattered, and that this was enough. The plaque with the program's name had been installed at the entrance of the basement service room in the main hotel. Martha Gable, it said, in simple letters on a white background, without subtitle, without date, without additional explanation. Simplicity was the right choice, and Nathan had made that decision alone in 10 seconds, which was the time it took to make decisions that had no doubt. Clara had been promoted to program coordinator. The decision had been Nathan's, but the recommendation had come from George, who had observed throughout the 2nd month how she interacted with colleagues, how she listened to demands, how she organized information and forwarded it with a precision that didn't come from any formal training, but from years of practice in solving difficult problems with scarce resources. Nathan had heard George's report and said he had reached the same conclusion by another path. Clara had received the promotion with the characteristic seriousness of someone who doesn't take things lightly, because they learned that things taken lightly charge their price later. She had asked 2 questions. What were the exact responsibilities of the position, and if there was a possibility of studying business administration to be more efficient in the role? Nathan had answered both in sequence. The responsibilities were documented in a file George would send that very afternoon, and the scholarship for the night business course was approved as of that moment. She had left the meeting with the 2 answers tucked in her head and had spent the rest of that day working with the same intensity as always, because intensity was a constant that didn't depend on context to exist. Matthew had started the new school at the beginning of the 2nd month. The enrollment process had been done with the help of Sarah, who had discovered during that period that her assistant role had gained dimensions that weren't in the original job description, but which she had adopted without question, because she was the type who understood that true work rarely fits completely on a piece of paper. On the first day of school, Matthew had left home at 6:50 with a new navy blue backpack, bought by Clara with the advance from her new salary, and had arrived at school 20 minutes early because he was the type of person who prefers waiting to being waited for. Clara had stood looking through the alley window until the sound of her son's footsteps disappeared on the street, and then had stayed a moment longer, looking at the silence that remained in place of the steps, with that expression mothers have when a son goes further away than he was before, and that is, at the same time, exactly what they wanted, and the beginning of something that hurts in a good way. Matthew's grades had arrived at the end of the 2nd month. From failing, which he had been in the previous school, to results above average in 4 of the 5 evaluated subjects. The history teacher had sent a note to the mother saying the student showed exceptional interest and analytical capacity above what was expected for the grade. Clara had read the note 3 times before putting it in the same folder where she kept important documents next to the new contract and the business course enrollment receipt. Mrs. Gable had gone through a re-evaluation appointment at the beginning of the 3rd month. Dr. Sterling had arrived with the usual case and had stayed longer than in previous weeks, examining, comparing, photographing the lesions for evolutionary recording. At the end, she had called Clara and said, with the same calm efficiency as always but with a different tone, that the situation had improved significantly, that the smaller ulcers had closed completely, that the larger ones were in a process of progressive healing, that with continued treatment and proper nutrition, the trend was toward sustained improvement. Clara had stood at the entrance of the room hearing that with an immobility that Mrs. Gable from the bed had recognized immediately. It was the immobility of someone holding too much at once so as not to drop anything. "You can drop a little bit, daughter," Mrs. Gable had said. "No one is looking." Clara had let it drop. And Mrs. Gable had stayed quiet until everything passed, with the patience of someone who knows that certain things need space to exist and that the role of those nearby is simply not to get in the way. One afternoon that week, Mrs. Gable had asked Clara to open the window wide. The early afternoon sun came straight in and warmed the sheet and her hands. She had stayed like that for a time she hadn't measured, with her eyes on the patch of sky the window showed, and an expression Clara had described to Nathan later as the expression of someone who finally arrived somewhere they had been trying to reach for a long time and who can rest a little before continuing. Nathan had listened to the description in silence, and he had thought that sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is to open a window. The official inauguration of the Martha program happened on a Thursday afternoon, in the 3rd month after that Tuesday, when a security report had reached Nathan Montgomery's desk and a pen had stopped in the air a millimeter from a dotted line. It wasn't the kind of inauguration Nathan usually held. There were no invited journalists, no PR team circulating with press releases, no photographer positioned to record the moment of the appetizer. There were the chain's employees, 243 people in total, gathered in the 18th floor ballroom of the main hotel for a reason most didn't yet fully know. There was George, the manager, who had arrived early to check the sound and the chair arrangement with the meticulousness that was the mark of his work. There was Sarah, who had organized the attendance list and the coffee break with the same efficiency she organized anything. There were the partner lawyers, the doctors who had joined the program, the representatives of the partnered educational institutions. And there was Clara Sanders, sitting in the front row in a blouse Nathan had never seen her wear. Formal without being stiff, the kind of clothes one buys when going somewhere that matters. Beside her was Matthew, in the new school shirt, his hair combed with a care that revealed someone had looked in the mirror longer than usual that morning. Mrs. Gable hadn't come to the event. She still wasn't in a condition for long trips, but she had known about everything, and when Clara had arrived earlier to tell the details, she had stayed in silence for a moment and then had said, with that economy of words that was characteristic of her, "Good." It was the right word. Not extravagant, not insufficient. Good. Nathan made a short speech, not because there wasn't much to say, but because he had learned in the previous months that certain things lose something when they are over-explained. He said the program had been born from an encounter, that this encounter had changed the way he saw the business he had built and the people who sustained it, that the program's name was the name of a woman who had taught him, without ever intending to, that the real value of anything built is measured by what it does for the people closest to it, not by the awards it receives from afar. He didn't mention any name other than Martha. He didn't explain the story. The people who needed to know already knew, and those who didn't would receive over time the direct experience of the program, which was more eloquent than any narrative. When he finished, there was applause. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of corporate events. It was the applause of people who recognize something real and respond to it with the authenticity of those who feel they have been seen. George applauded standing up. Sarah did too, which was notable considering she rarely showed anything in public that could be classified as visible emotion. Matthew clapped with the characteristic seriousness of his face, but his eyes shone in a way that had no seriousness inside. Clara Sanders didn't applaud. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the plaque with her mother's name on the wall behind the improvised stage, and had an expression that needed no other translation. After the event, while people chatted around the coffee break, Nathan crossed the room and went to where Clara was, standing by the window looking out at Fifth Avenue below. "How are you?" he asked. She stayed a moment before answering. "Last night," she said, "my mother asked me to pull the chair close to the window. She sat there for about 20 minutes looking at the street. It's the first time in years she's done that. She always stayed just in bed because she was too weak or in too much pain or too tired. Yesterday she spent 20 minutes at the window seeing the movement outside." Nathan stared at her. "So, you're doing well," he said. "I am," she confirmed. "In a way, I haven't been for a long time." Matthew approached the two. In his hands he had a cup of juice and a small plate of snacks he had taken from the coffee break, with the naturalness of someone in a place where they have a right to be, which was, in that context, an achievement that didn't appear in any minutes but which Nathan recorded internally, with the clarity of someone who knows how to recognize a result when they see it. "I have a question," Matthew said to Nathan, direct, without preamble, which was his way of communicating when he had decided he was going to communicate. "Ask away." "Do you regret anything you did before all this happened?" Nathan stared at the teenager. It was a question too direct to be answered evasively, and it was direct in the way only someone who hasn't yet learned to avoid certain questions can be. "Yes," he said, taking so long to ask the right questions to the right people. Matthew nodded as if that were a satisfactory answer, and returned his attention to the plate of snacks, which was, in turn, the most honest response possible to what Nathan had said. Later that afternoon, after the room had emptied and George had left with his folder of documents, and Sarah had forwarded the last emails of the day, Nathan went to the alley. It was a visit without warning, as the visits had become over the last few months, because Mrs. Gable had said one afternoon that a visit with warning is a doctor's visit, and that he wasn't a doctor anymore, he was a people visit. Nathan had accepted the distinction. She was in the chair by the window exactly as Clara had described. The sun had shifted angle, but there was still enough light for the room to have a different quality than it had on the first night he had entered. More open, more breathable. Not because the space had changed size, because it hadn't, but because what was inside the space had changed weight. He sat beside her, in the usual low chair. "Clara told me you sat by the window yesterday," he said. Mrs. Gable smiled. "It does good to see the world up close, I had forgotten." There was a comfortable silence. Outside, the neighborhood had its late afternoon rhythm, children returning from school, the smell of dinner starting in the kitchens, the dog still sleeping in the middle of the street, with the conviction of someone who was never convinced that was wrong. Then Nathan remembered something, and he asked, "Mrs. Gable, do you still remember a backpack?" The elderly woman turned her head to him. She looked for a moment, and then something in the back of her eyes opened, like when a drawer that hasn't been opened in a long time slides on the track and reveals what was stored. "It was blue," she said, "with a little bear embroidered on the front pocket. It lasted about 3 years until it burst from so many books you stuffed inside." Nathan said nothing for a moment. "I didn't remember until the first night I was here," he said, "when you said you had bought it. I tried to remember, and the image came gradually. The backpack, the little bear, the smell of new school. I must have been about 8. 8 and 2 months, she corrected, with the precision of someone who kept the date. "You were ashamed because your backpack had broken and you didn't want your classmates to see. I went to the stationery store on the way to school and bought the prettiest one they had for the price I could afford. It was blue with a little bear because it was the one I saw first and I thought you would like it." "I did," Nathan said. "I liked it very much. I kept the backpack even after it burst. It stayed in the bedroom closet for years. I didn't quite know why I kept it. Now I do." Mrs. Gable stared at him. "Why?" she asked. Not because she didn't know, but because sometimes things need to be said aloud to exist completely. "Because it was the only gift anyone had given me with that kind of care," Nathan said. "Not because it was a birthday, not because it was an obligation. because I needed it and you went to get it. That stays." Mrs. Gable was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the voice that had lost volume but never lost the truth, "You were a good boy. I know life made you store a lot of things deep inside, but the good boy was still there. I knew he was." Nathan was silent. And then, without anyone needing to see, without a security camera, without a report of any kind, a tear ran down the face of a man who had built an empire and had only understood its true value when he knelt beside a humble bed and recognized the woman who, with gentle hands and without any formal obligation, had filled the void that a difficult childhood had left. Mrs. Gable said nothing. She only reached out and rested her hand on his, as she had done that first night, as she had done decades ago in a bedroom of a child with a nightmare, with the same gentle firmness as always. And Nathan stayed. Because some stories don't end. They transform into other stories, which transform into still others, and what remains is not the end, but the movement, the gesture that passed from one hand to another in the dark, and that found, at the right moment, the hand that was ready to receive. The end. And it is here that we pause for a moment, dear listeners, because the story of Nathan, Clara, Matthew, and Mrs. Gable is not just a story of regret and reparation. It is a story about what happens when someone decides to stop before signing, look before judging, and listen before concluding. It is a story that exists within many real stories, in many nameless alleys, in many rooms with faded floral curtains, in many hands that care in silence without anyone asking what is behind it. If this story reached you and stayed somewhere inside, if Mrs. Gable's voice echoed in someone you know or in something you yourself lived, then it fulfilled what it came to do. We bring stories like this every day, stories that explore what is most complex and most true in people's lives. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, this is the moment. A click that costs nothing and ensures that the next story reaches you the moment it is released. Also, leave your like, because each one tells us that what we are doing here matters, and that information is the fuel that makes us continue. And in the comments, tell us, which part of this story stayed with you? Was it the blue backpack? Was it Mrs. Gable's silence in forgiveness? Was it Matthew with the snack plate at the event? We read everything. We respond, and we are here waiting for you. Until the next story.